This sitting is resumed.
Order number 5, ma'am. In the name of the Honorable Acting Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the cess on milk bill 2018.
Senator Bayasuka, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, this bill that is before us now for consideration is one that really, I think, dovetails nicely with the earlier discussions that we have. This is a cess on milk bill, and we started earlier today looking at essentially a discussion on the agriculture and the support that government gives to agriculture. And I can put this in that context because the cess on milk really is about supporting the dairy industry. Of course, it was in the context of revenue-raising measures that the Minister of Finance had announced in his financial statement and budgetary proposals of 2015, August 2015. Madam President, this also, this discussion that we had earlier on sweetened beverages and obesity and what we really should be drinking, I think also fits nicely into this discussion. Here we are trying to incentivize the production of milk, and certainly we know that milk is, for most people, a healthier option than some of the sweetened, than any of the sweetened drinks, Madam President, that are available on offer from whether it's supermarkets or restaurants or wherever. But Madam President, as I was saying, back in August of 2015, the Minister of Finance announced at that time the cess to be implemented on all milk and milk substitutes. The idea was that there would be a rate of 5% for milk products containing 60% of or more liquid fresh milk, and a 10% rate of cess for all other milks and milk substitutes. He had indicated that this would be imposed across all relevant imports and also on locally processed milk. Of course, the idea is that with the different trade agreements that we have, what you do for imported stuff, you have to do on the locally produced milk as well. The idea, as I said earlier, was that it would raise revenue. It was expected that such a cess would generate revenue of around $5 million initially, and that could actually rise to about $8 million. So in that proposal, for this cess to be introduced, the requirement was that the farm gate price for milk collected from farms would be increased by 25 cents per kilogram. As I said, this would be to incentivize farmers so that they would see their way to expanding production and that the processor then could access the additional supply and, of course, ultimately reduce the import quantities of powder. Again, reducing the imports and increasing production and incentivizing the production of milk, rather, and also incentivizing our farmers in this regard, the dairy farmers. The subsidy from government is proposed to be fixed at $1.17 per kilogram, and the subsidy would be paid directly to farmers based on their supply and would be applied solely to milk utilized in the processing of milk, which contains at a minimum 60% of liquid cow's milk. The cess, as I said just now, would be levied at two rates: 5% on milk containing no less than 60% of liquid cow's milk, and 10% on all other milk and milk substitute products. And that also is reflected in the bill and in the schedule to the bill, Madam President. At that time, the minister also proposed that there would be a national dairy board established, and that board would have representatives on it from among the farmers, the processors, as well as government. The idea behind this National Dairy Board would be to manage the interaction between the farmer and the processor and to continually monitor the industry metrics to ensure that there's the most efficient use of all the resources that are used and the raw milk mechanism. Of course, it was proposed at the time that the government would designate the chairman in this regard. And so, Madam President, I said this was 2015. Here we are at 2018. The drafting of this bill, as we have seen in this chamber with so much other legislation, has to go back and forth, certainly in the tables that they use for the cess and other taxes. The categories had to be disaggregated, because also in the category for milk are certain other non-alcoholic beverages, non-alcoholic wines, and so on, so that the control of customs had to be involved. And there was some back and forth between the ministry, the control of customs, and the Chief Parliamentary Council. Several questions were raised, and so it took a while, but here we are today. The cess would be then imposed on condensed milk, on flavored milk, on milk in general, and milk-based beverages, as well as milk substitute beverages, Madam President. As I said, those imported as well as those produced locally. There is also in the schedule, Madam President, a proviso that preparations for infant use would not, the cess would not apply to those products, to the preparations for infant use, as well as beverages that already attract the imposition of excise tax at a rate of 10%. There are other beverages there. Madam President, of course, you know, when you start talking about the not having a cess on the preparations for infant use, of course, there is concern, and I know there is concern among nurses and doctors that perhaps we are encouraging the use of these formulas rather than breastfeeding. But, Madam President, we would recall that I think it was just last week when we spoke in the estimates, I did mention that at the QEH, they have also been recognized and certified for their role in promoting breastfeeding. And we have seen across the country that there is an emphasis that is being placed on breast milk, of course, being the best for the baby. We understand that there are certain conditions, for example, when the mother, and I think even that has been amended, where the mother is HIV positive, that there are some concerns with breastfeeding in that regard. But by and large, it is recommended that the baby get the breast milk. Breast is best, is how that saying goes. Breast milk is best milk for the baby. I see my colleague questioning what I just said. The breast milk is that's what I meant when I said breast is best. The breast milk, Madam President, is the best milk for the baby. I hope that is abundantly clear and I'm not misquoted in that regard. This cess, of course, Madam President, would be collected by the Revenue Commissioner, and where condensed milk, flavored milks, milk-based beverages, and milk substitute beverages are imported, the cess imposed shall be charged on the CIF, the cost, insurance, and freight value of the condensed milk, the flavored milk, etc. As I said before, the idea is that the subsidy would then, this would allow for a subsidy to be paid to the dairy farmers and enable them to produce then at a higher volume. So that was the idea behind the CIS. The CIS would then support the subsidy that would be paid. As I said earlier, a subsidy would be paid directly to farmers based on their supply. So it is proposed that there would be this subsidy that would allow them to produce a higher volume of milk at a mutually desirable price, because at the end of the day, that is what it's all about for the farmers. And it would allow then a reduction of imports and ultimately an increase in the export also of milk and an expansion of the local dairy farm. We know that the dairy farming, the industry, has faced many challenges, not least of which has been pre-deal larceny. From time to time, we do see in the media some, awful reports about the theft and the ravaging of some of these beautiful beasts, Madam President. But we do now have in place the Pre-deal Larceny Act, and it is anticipated that once this is fully implemented, that we can actually be able to see the end of that particular travesty, Madam President. And so, Madam President, it is also hoped that with dairy farmers producing more milk, less importation, but with dairy farmers locally producing more milk, that milk is one of those beverages that we could encourage more Barbadians to drink. We just now had a discussion on the sweetened beverages, and we do know that milk is a healthier option. Milk, of course, has lower sugar by far than some of the soft drinks than any of the soft drinks that we consume, Madam President. And milk also has protein as well as an abundance, Madam President, of minerals and vitamins. I remember hearing when I was small that milk was a complete food. That is what they taught us at school, that milk was a complete food. Milk had the protein, of course it had calcium for healthy bones, and potassium and vitamin D and phosphorus, Madam President, vitamin B12, vitamin A, vitamin B2, as well as niacin. There's also been research, Madam President, to suggest that where sugary drinks are substituted with healthier options, including milk, that we can actually see weight loss. We have determined in Barbados that one of the things that contributes to the obesity to which Senator Fraser spoke is the consumption of sugar. And Barbadians consume too much sugar. I think perhaps not even realizing how much sugar is in the soft drinks that they consume. And there are people who, and children too, Madam President, who would drink 2 and 3 and 4 soft drinks in a day, consuming too much sugar. To underscore what Senator Fraser was saying, we had the Health of the Nation survey, and that actually showed that there was a 33.8% obesity among adults. And yes, women were found to be more obese than men, and women were also found to be less physically active than men. But I've been seeing ads, Madam President, promoting the use of non-sugary drinks. Just yesterday, I think it was, I saw on the television a locally produced ad where we are encouraging persons to drink more milk and water and coconut water and so on. And that would certainly carry us a long way. Of course, we know that for strong bones and teeth is what we've been told growing up, Madam President, for strong bones and teeth, and the USDA actually recommends at least 3 servings of milk or milk products a day. We do have milk and milk products available. As I said, I think that not enough people are consuming the milk, and certainly it would benefit our farmers if we perhaps had such a drive to encourage the consumption of milk as a healthier alternative. And I think that hand in hand with the cess, the predial larceny legislation, and other legislation that is there to discourage importation, to encourage the increased production by our local dairy farmers, and then encourage the consumption by Barbadians, we can actually see that industry increase. We can see that industry thrive. Thereby, Madam President, underscoring what was said earlier, that government continues to support in multiple ways the agricultural industry in several areas of agriculture, this being but another area of support being given to agriculture, Madam President. And so I don't think that there is much more that I need to add, Madam President, rather beyond touting the benefits of milk and the value of the cess itself for our local dairy industry, Madam President. And with that, Madam President, I would want to beg that this bill be read a second time.
Senator Fraser, you have the floor.
Lactose has to be broken down into simple sugars in order to be absorbed, in order to provide the currency of the metabolism of the body, that is glucose. Now, the lactose being a sugar twice the size, it has a very different effect when it's absorbed into the gut than glucose. And the failure of the gut to break down lactose in those people who cannot break it down with the enzyme lactase means that the lactose goes through the gut and it acts by osmosis, as those who went to law school, like Senator Todd will recall from his biology teacher. Osmosis means that water is absorbed into the gut and the result is going to be diarrhea. The other consequences for those of us who lack the enzyme lactase will be bloating, discomfort, anorexia, general discomfort, as well as the diarrhea. And this occurs in different populations. The presence of lactose intolerance increases as you go close to the equator, decreases as you go to the north. Laplanders, for example, have hardly any lactose intolerance. It hardly ever occurs. The Nordics, the Scandinavians hardly have any lactose intolerance. Europeans, as a rule, are only about 20% of people have lactose intolerance. In Africa and Asia, the more tropical countries, where perhaps for evolutionary reasons that we won't go into, the lactose intolerance is between 80 and 90% of the population, which means that those of us who are the product of African genes will be 90% likely to be lactose intolerant. People like me, whitish people, become lactose intolerant in middle age. I didn't become lactose intolerant until I was 50. And so that may be a representation of my African ancestors, that I'm one of those whitish looking people who are lactose intolerant. Now, this intolerance is so common in Barbados that we, growing up, as I'm sure Senator Boyce will recall, he's not quite in my generation, but growing up, the only milk that most of us had, unless you had a cow or your neighbor had a cow, the only milk that most of us had was condensed milk, which is 90% sugar. Very little milk in condensed milk, but it gave the coffee and the tea a whitish color, and so on. But when Pine Hill Dairy was established more than 50 years ago, and people could drink milk, and people were encouraged to drink milk, people were drinking a glass of milk here and a glass of milk there, and most people said, this milk is bad, because they got diarrhea. They couldn't tolerate it. They didn't know why. And it doesn't seem as if the people who were the directors of Pine Hill Dairy, or the marketing agents, or the staff, or anyone else was actually educating people about lactose intolerance. Dogs, too, are lactose intolerant once they're weaned. And so this is the same thing that happens with most of our tropical countries, the populations of our tropical countries. People become lactose intolerant quite early in life, basically when they become adults. Whitish people later in life. And a lot of people become symptomatic, and they don't know why, because they have drunk milk until the age of maybe 40, 50, 60, and suddenly they're getting gastrointestinal symptoms, and they think they're very ill. And I remember the first lady that I had, who looked Caucasian, looked white, came to me with this terrible GI complaint. She was aged about 70, and it took one of my gastroenterology colleagues to solve the problem, because I didn't pick up the fact. I didn't take a detailed diet history at that time. And this lady developed her problems on a Sunday night and on a Monday, because on a Sunday her diet was completely different. And they indulged in lots of ice cream and desserts when they had a family party, and they were eating ice cream and desserts laden with milk. And that was when she had her problem, because she had never been a milk drinker throughout life. So, Madam President, I make this point because the composition of milk is important. It's a whole food, as you said. It's full of protein. And I must make the contrast, because people who recognize that they are not able to tolerate milk because they're lactase deficient or lactose intolerant are persuaded that they must drink almond milk. Now, almond milk is basically white water, in which in the recent years they have actually added calcium and vitamin D, so that when you put it into your coffee and tea, it looks as if you've had milk. It doesn't have a great deal of flavor. It doesn't taste like milk. And it's got 1 gram of protein per glass. And it's imported. It's not made locally. So it's another source of drainage of our foreign exchange in order to drink white water. Well, the term white water usually means the foam on those rapids in North America where people go floating down the rapids. That's the other kind of white water, and it's probably just as nutritious as almond milk. So, Madam President, I make this point because, unfortunately, many of our doctors haven't had enough nutrition education and appear to be unaware of the issue of lactose intolerance. And I have known some people who've been told that they seem to be becoming allergic to milk because of the diarrhea, the nausea, and the flatulence. It's nothing to do with an allergy. It is lactose intolerance. Now, this is a problem because the process of creating the lactose-free milk requires an extra process at the dairy, at the factory. And this means that the production costs are a little bit higher. And this will put off people who think, well, the budget is tight. But it really should not be a problem because it means that they're getting good nutrition, and the only better source of protein, together with your appropriate fats, is the tin of sardines for 2 something a tin. So here I make the plea, because I always say the 100% Barbados by motto, by Barbados, by 100%, is not truly practical. There are a few things that we don't make in Barbados, and you cannot buy any fish quite as cheaply as that tin of sardines. So we are not making cheese, which is very nutritious, although certain people shouldn't have too much of it. We're not making sardines, we're not making red wine. So in terms of your diet, the red wine is good for your blood vessels. The sardines is terribly important, and I would encourage that that's where you spend your 5 or 10% of money on food that you cannot get in Barbados. Milk is great. I would like to end, Madam President, simply by being a little bit provocative. Why can't we have cesses on other major food groups in order to incentivize and assist the local farmers with all those vegetables that they're producing so that we can buy our vegetables more cheaply and overcome the issue of predial larceny to which the leader on this resolution spoke. That is something that I would like to see whether we can consider. It may be in my ignorance of the WTO regulations, it may be it couldn't work, but if we can have a cess on milk to incentivize the farmers and make milk available more readily, then perhaps we could look at other things that we can produce a cess on. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator Worrell, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. And I rise to support this bill to introduce the cess on milk. And I must say that I've waited a long time to be able to speak in this debate and to actually endorse this cess on milk. From the time it was introduced in the budget of 2015, I was longing for this day to come. In fact, there was one point in time where I thought that the cess was already in place because I knew that it would bring about the idea that you would have cheaper supply of milk in the supermarkets and to consumers. And that is the reason why I want to support this, this legislation. No, I'm not supporting it from the perspective of being a dairy farmer. I'm supporting it from the perspective of being a consumer of milk and someone who actually loves to drink milk. And I do remember that prior to 2015, when this cess was introduced, there was an incident where the dairy farmers, the milk producer, complained that the milk was not selling. And they did have a large volume of milk which they feared that they would have to dump. So they basically reduced the price of the milk and in the supermarkets. And I was quite pleased to see how quickly that milk went, because often when you went into the supermarkets, you saw person shopping, and instead of having 1 carton of milk, you saw at least 3 or 4 cartons of milk in the trolleys. So this tells you that Barbadians are quite eager or willing to drink and consume milk. And but the problem was the price of the milk. So this cess, even though it may seem as though, because when most people hear of a cess, they may have the impression that it means that it's going to increase the cost of the particular product. But with this cess, the whole idea is that it would reduce, to some extent, the cost of the fresh milk available here in Barbados, because the cess is being provided to the dairy farmers so that they can they would basically receive a better price for, the milk that they provide to the major producers of milk. I also to mention, over the years, because we've become accustomed to one major supplier of milk or producer of milk in Barbados, but over the years, there have been a few other persons who've tried to come into the market. And in having discussion, because there's one particular supplier who I realized was actually in production not too far from where I live in St. John. And after speaking to that person, he explained to me one of his constraints, because this supplier would normally have a wide selection of flavored milks beyond the traditional vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry. But you also had flavors that, that would appeal to most Barbadians. One that I particularly like would be the coffee milk. You also had a soursop, which I enjoy. And recently you will see a coconut milk, a coconut flavored milk. And there are a number of, the Morby milk as well, soursop, a number of interesting flavors, a ginger milk as well, that was produced by this particular supplier. What I recognize is that when I go into the supermarket, sometimes I would see it, other times I would not see the milk in the supermarket. So I took it upon myself to call when I recognized that the dairy was actually in St. John, I took it upon myself to call the supplier, and he explained to me that his problem was in terms of being able to have the quantity. And one of the things that he was hoping for was for this particular legislation to be passed, this cess on milk, because that would definitely make it easier for him to produce and to maintain the quantity and the supply. So I am glad to say that we have finally kept our word and brought this particular piece of legislation, because I can see the potential that it will have in terms of business development in Barbados and employment opportunities as well for persons who work within the dairy industry, and persons in other fields as well would benefit from this particular legislation. A few years ago, and I think at that time it caught the attention of those persons who have an interest in planes and watching the planes come into the airport. You had a jumbo plane that came in that brought in cows. Right. The interest in that is that it was a big jumbo plane, and you saw all of these cows coming off the plane, and they came from the front part of the plane where the nose of the plane was open up to allow them to come out. So for persons who are interested in aviation in Barbados, that was probably the first time that one of those planes ever came here. But the purpose of that was that they were bringing in fresh cows. I think it was for the dairy industry, so that when this particular cess came in place, that we would have in Barbados adequate livestock, that we would be able to produce the quantity of milk that would be necessary. So even though it took a long time to happen, it finally came, but persons were working towards this. And I can imagine that it's not just that one company, but there was also another company, which I think was in St. Philip, who produce flavored milk, and you can imagine that more and more suppliers of flavored milk will come onto the market. So it means that you will be creating employment for some persons, and also putting income into the hands of some families, because a lot of this industry is operated by families. So you'll be putting income into the hands of a number of Barbadian families. I think from the estimates in the budget of 2015, in that year it was estimated that the dairy industry was roughly about 40.3 million, which was below what it used to be operating at in terms of 50 to 60 million years ago. And that is why it was necessary to bring this particular cess in place to revive more or less the dairy industry, because outside of Barbados, a number of dairy farmers outside of Barbados, they receive incentives for their production. Barbados was the only country, or one of the few countries, who did not provide that incentives. And therefore, our dairy farmers, we were supplying milk at a higher price than what could have been imported. And it was thought that it was necessary to introduce this cess to give them a little bit of a competitive advantage, so that this cess would be able to provide a subsidy to farmers to keep them going, so that the price of the milk would be at a competitive price, and which would be at a good price that persons would be able to afford it. And I'm certain that you will see more people reaching for milk as that first option. When they're thinking of a beverage, they will reach for milk first instead of the carbonated beverages or other sweetened drinks. And this is good in terms of getting children, in particular, using milk. If you get them to drinking milk from an early age, it is something that will continue with them throughout their life. So yes, it does lead in to the health plan for the country, in terms of you want our people to be making healthier choices in terms of their diet and utilizing healthier foods. So this is a good way to start that program. But you obviously have to make sure that the products are at a price that we can afford. And once the milk is at a good price, it has already been proven that Barbadians will purchase the milk. Out of the milk industry as well, not just milk directly, but there are other avenues as well. We do have companies in Barbados who produce cheese, and in order to produce the cheese, you would need to have access to fresh milk. So again, through this incentive, that industry would also begin to bloom as well. Once upon a time, we could, the yogurt, I'm not certain that you don't see it as often, but there's another small company in Barbados that produces yogurt. Unfortunately, that yogurt is, when you can get a yogurt for like $1.90 to $2, that yogurt is in the price range of $3. So you would really have to be a buy local person or someone who wants to push the buy local campaign to actually reach for that particular yogurt. But it is a very good yogurt, but I'm hoping that through this incentive, that yogurt supplier would also be able to produce a more reasonable, more affordable yogurt that will be bought by more people in Barbados. So this will definitely contribute to the economy, agriculture, and have more people drinking healthier, making healthier choices in beverages. And I am happy, and I want to commend the Minister of Finance and this administration to sticking to their guns. There must have been a reason why it took them 3 years to bring this piece of legislation after it being promised in the budget of 2015. But we kept our word, and it is here, and I'm certain that there are a number of dairy farmers in Barbados who are quite happy to see it, because it will definitely benefit them and bring back some life to an industry that was possibly on the verge of collapse or dying, and an industry that I don't think that we can afford to do without here in Barbados. So, Madam President, I support this bill.
Senator Adams, you have the floor.
Madam President, I want to support this resolution. This bill, the cess bill on cess of milk. And I suppose I ought to say that it's better late than never. I know Senator Worrell was saying that it took 3 years, and if something is good, sometimes even if it's a little delayed, we should still be happy to have it. But I want to make a plug, as usual, for small farmers, small business people. I think you might remember, Madam President, that Senator Watson did introduce a small business resolution, which was seconded by myself. And so I would never give up the opportunity to speak for the small farmer. And this is a situation here again where the small farmer in Barbados actually led the way. Long before we had large-scale farming, and before we had the Pine Hill dairy, we had the small farmer in Barbados who really had livestock in the backyard and who sometimes had a small acreage of land and would have their his livestock. And it is interesting to note that in the 1950 census, it was found that there were 15,000 dairy cattle in Barbados, along with some 49,000 heads of sheep and goat. And that was very interesting, particularly in the case of the herd, because it was pretty difficult in the early history of Barbados, certainly before the 1940s and 50s and so on, and before then, for small people to have cows. Sometimes it was hard for them to have a sheep or a goat, but impediments were put in their way for having cows, because it meant that they were getting a bit too uppity, getting a little bit too rich. And so impediments were put in their way in relation to where they could graze. If the cow went on the plantation pasture or in the canes and so on, to be taken either into the plantation yard, you have to go and pay for it, or indeed to the station. And it was very, very difficult, and it was done, Madam President, to make sure that the small local black man would not be able to have that degree of independence, and so would always have to be dependent on the plantation. But I mention that to say that that entrepreneurial spirit was extremely important and had been ingrained in the small small businessman in Barbados for many a year. And it had too, Madam, to do with the fact that it gave them a sense of food security, especially in an area, say, in the production of protein, where in those days you were working for such small wages, and indeed those who were salaried, small salaries, that the food that was eaten at the time was highly one of carbohydrates, and the cost of protein, meat and so on, and indeed milk would have been fairly expensive. And so as a result of the rearing of the cattle, one was able in the village to get your own milk and to sell the surplus. Not only to do that, but there was a kind of a small cottage industry whereby butter was actually made. And those of us of my age would know how the milk was put down overnight. Then you skim the top off, and you put it in a bottle, and then you kind of churn it, and you took that off, and from there, the resourceful women, the mothers, and the young ladies in the house, I think some boys too, were able to make what they call fresh butter. And even the liquid that was left was also not thrown away. It was also utilized. They had a name for it, I don't remember. But it shows the ingenuity of the our early Barbadian people in the village. And we moved to a situation where farming developed. In those days, we did not have any refrigeration and things of that nature. And so the industry was at a primary stage. What this cess will tend to encourage is the concept of the secondary and the tertiary section of agriculture. And so we have the dairy and the dairy products, and which would lead, one, to the fact that you would have a number of products that you would not normally have had. It would also lead to increased employment. And so a number of our young people will also be able to get employment as a result of that. And will drive home the point that agriculture is not only a primary industry, that it is also a secondary and a tertiary industry, and in that sense ought to be developed. And the concept of food security is extremely important, because food security in a way is as important as national security, because we all have to eat. And of course, if we do not eat, we will all die. So it is in the interest of all governments, and indeed all people, to ensure that we have a good supply of food, in this case, and dairy products. And not only that we have a good supply of food, but that it is wholesome food, number one, and number two, that it is safe, and number three, that it is affordable. And the concept of safety, Madam President, is very important, because we do not know, for example, where we get our imported food. That we might know the country, but we do not know the exact processing and so on that goes on in relation to the food that we import. We know, for example, that a lot of chemicals are put in our foods. Some of them are extremely harmful. We know sometimes that the type of food that are exported from those countries are not the type that they themselves use. And therefore, we are recipient of sometimes rather harmful imported food products. And we also know the concept of the genetic interference with crops, which also is harmful for persons in the third world. So we believe that we ought to be very serious in relation to producing our own food. In number one, that Barbadians would know that the food is safe. They would know that no harmful chemicals and so on are put in the food. And in the case of putting a cess on the imported food stuff, it means that more and more we would be able to get affordable food. And therefore, those are areas that are extremely important. The concept of the cost of food is extremely important. I have here some statistics compiled. Well, they're compiled by certain government agencies, but reported by the Central Bank, by Mr. Chelston Brathwaite. And he said, for example, that in the year 2011, the Central Bank reported that Barbados imported some $653 million in food stuff. And that in the year 2008, 2009, it was only half of that, just about $359 million, which means that in a very short space of time, we doubled the cost of imported food. Whether it was just that the cost went up or whatever, the point is that we had to look for foreign exchange in order to pay for that type of import. And therefore, we are saying that our import bill, in the space of 3 years, it was estimated that it rose by some 45%. And that is rather phenomenal, and something that we in this country cannot afford, and is a drain on the resources of the country. It also means that we are actually exporting our employment, because rather than putting our own people, particularly our young people, to work, we are actually subsidizing the workers of that foreign country, most likely the United States. Even if it is a CARICOM country, sometimes we want to know that home drums beat first. And in the case of CARICOM, I would say that sometimes that is reciprocal. We would export to them, and vice versa, and they would export to us. But in a case like the United States and so on, it is something that we ought not to do, considering that they, while trying to impose penalties on us for supporting our agriculture, they support their agriculture to the hilt. And that is something that we ought to know. And sometimes we believe that governments ought to stand up to these organizations in relation to the pressure that they put on small island developing states. So we have, still on the statistic area, some $24 million of fresh frozen vegetables were imported into this country. I wonder what are those vegetables. I don't know how exotic they are or whatever, but they have to be carrots and tomatoes and apples and things of that nature, all of which we produce here in Barbados. The Honorable Senator Boyce, himself a small farmer, would certainly agree. His wife, I'm told, I'm in that category too. I am a backyard farmer, but my wife does the farming. I do the encouraging. but I am sure, I am sure that using modern techniques, the millions of persons, the thousands of persons in Barbados, even BARP, because BARP has a program dealing with small farming and so on, that we could produce a tremendous quantity of fresh foods, wholesome foods, and indeed affordable foods for our people here. We also have a problem with the chronic diseases and the CNDs, and of course, I wouldn't go through all of them, but it is very acceptable and clear to all as a consensus that the more we improve our diet, the better it is to stave off the diabetes and the various other diseases that are harming our people, especially the elderly. And therefore, we have a further reason for actually supporting this cess in the fact that it will bring wholesome food to our people and increase the health and the lifestyle of our population, both young and old. So those are some of the reasons that I think the nutrition part is very important. But I want to also add here that Dr. Chelston Brathwaite also made another very important point. I was trying to remember if Senator Haynes did mention this in one of her presentations. But he was saying, for example, that it is not only the primary production of agriculture that is important, especially in all countries, but especially in developing countries. And it is something that we ought to consider. He also spoke about the value added to the primary production of agricultural products, in this case, milk and dairy products. He said, for example, using some statistics, that in countries like Argentina, this is in Central South America, the primary agricultural production was actually 4.6%. But when the value added was taken into consideration. That moved all the way up to 32.2%. What that really means in very simple terms, that the secondary and tertiary production of added on to the primary production catapulted that percentage to GDP from 4.6% all the way up to 32.2%. He doesn't have any of the Caribbean countries here, but he has also mentioned countries like Canada, which is a very large country which produce a lot of agricultural products, 1.8% primary production. But when the value added is taken into consideration, 15.3%. And it goes on and on. The lowest probably was the United States, which produced 0.7%, and the value added was only 8%. But Costa Rica and Uruguay and Mexico and so on, all of those countries where statistics were available indicated that the value added, which means not only is making the country richer, but it is providing employment for the population in the country, particularly the small people. And so in Barbados, we are very happy to see that action is being taken to support the dairy farmers in this country, to make sure that the population is sensitized and educated to look towards the local production instead of the foreign production, and that the funds available from the cess the funds are going to be used directly and indirectly, but sometimes, but certainly directly given to the farmers, and I am particularly making a case for the small farmers, those people who were in the forefront, and those persons who in fact are the ones that cry out loudest in relation to the lack of incentives and so on over the years, which they were always calling for. Sometimes they were getting it, but now in this specific area, we are happy to see that the cess is being introduced and that they will be able to benefit in a very significant way, and that the country as a whole will benefit from safer food, safer dairy products, from employment, and for the possibility of having affordable dairy products in the supermarket. And with those few words, Madam President, I want to thank you.
Senator Bayasuku, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, all this discussion of agriculture, of course, you know, it's one thing you can count on in this upper chamber is that the discussion, though it will vary, is always very rich and very relevant, for the most part, to enlighten us and to educate us on the matters. Hearing our other gentlemen farmers speak of the dairy farms and the small farms, I think I may have disclosed in this chamber, Madam President, that when I was a little girl, my Trinidadian grandmother was a dairy farmer, and when I visited her, it was my job at such times that I was there to ensure that when this was in Trinidad, when the Nestle Nestle truck came around to collect the milk, as they did in these big tins, when they came around, it was my job to get up early in the morning, meet the truck, and made sure that they weighed it and what was on the scale they wrote in the book, and collect the money accordingly. And reading, that was my job, and I was about 5 or 6 years old, and that was my job at 5 or 6, to make sure, and then I also had to count the money for my grandmother and make sure it was documented as well. She trained me she trained me in business, Madam President, but not in marketing, in business, and she started there with her dairy farm. She had her hands in a number of businesses, but as far as the dairy farm goes, it was my responsibility to make sure that the milk was weighed, and you know, they hung it on this, with the chain, and they hung it up with this dial of a scale, and that what they recorded in the book was what I had recorded in the book, and that I received the money and so on. So this is how, Madam President, it is proposed that when the milk is sold to the processor, who still goes around and collects milk from the small farmer and the not so small farmer, when the milk is collected, that documentation is done, and that there's a subsidy that will be paid at a fixed rate on the weight of the milk that is provided. Madam President, so we have had discussions on milk, on the value of milk, the virtue of milk, on the fact that there are certain challenges for some people to have milk, but of course we know that there are other options as well. There's certainly several varieties of lactose-free milks and so on, Madam President, but still to advise that, and especially for our children, and where we are very, very concerned about childhood obesity, and we need to have children move away from sweetened drinks, that we introduce milk as one of those healthy foods, and certainly away from snacks and all those processed snacks that they have. Remembering that, as I said, milk has a lot of vitamin D. I'm advised that milk has as much vitamin D as a serving of salmon, a 3.5-ounce serving of salmon, as much calcium as 2.5 cups of broccoli, as much potassium as a small banana. And everybody talks about potassium and going to get the banana, but a cup of milk has as much potassium as a small banana, as much vitamin A as 2 baby carrots, and as much phosphorus as a whole cup of kidney beans. So it is, and of course we mentioned that it has protein, which is good especially for our children. And so we need to use milk more. Persons who've read magazines from overseas would recall when the dairy industry in the United States started the promotions with milk. There was one slogan, "Got milk," and you would see popular personalities, whether they be athletes or models or television personalities or so on, promoting milk. And perhaps we need, as we want to boost our dairy industry, and as this imposition of the cess allows us to see that growth in the dairy industry, that we would see some more promotion, encouraging the use of milk as a very healthy alternative. Madam President, and also to buttress what we've been saying today about the support to agriculture, I am pleased to announce that agriculture is not dying. I know that perhaps a few years ago there was a lament that agriculture is dying, that our young people are not interested in agriculture. Maybe spurred on by the crisis and the fact of the youth unemployment, I am seeing a lot of young people involved in agriculture. My ministry, of course, has worked through the Human Resource Development Strategy with the Ministry responsible for agriculture, and we've done the Youth Agripreneurship Program, which is a program that sees young people not only learning the techniques of agriculture, but also learning the business end of agriculture as well. And also promoting, as Senator Adams spoke to, not only the primary but the secondary and tertiary aspects of agriculture as well. And that's the Youth Agripreneurship Program. There's a Youth in Agriculture Program. We've worked with IECA. And so there are a lot of programs ongoing. And even now, I am working in St. George South with 2 groups of young men who are interested in farming. One group is doing poultry farming, and another group is looking to do pig farming. So I'm seeing young people coming to me saying, look, we need to supplement our income, or we need employment opportunities here. How can we get this agricultural program going? And so I've been working with them, referring them to the various sources for assistance, and there are a number of facilities through which they can get assistance. And so I think there is hope. And with government continuing to do things like we've discussed today, we will continue to see a growth of agriculture. Bearing in mind, too, that our new physical development plan also earmarks areas that are just to be focused on agriculture as well. So everything is coming together so that we can see the growth of agriculture. And we've discussed and that this also benefits us in terms of our food security, but also in terms of our foreign exchange, importing less, perhaps having more to export, and startling figures that were revealed by Senator Adams there from the central bank and Dr. Brathwaite, that in just a few years our food import bill doubled. And, that's one of the things I was remarking recently. I've lived in Trinidad with I mentioned my grandmother's there, so I've spent time in Trinidad, and I've seen through the difficult periods, economic crisis and so on, where you didn't have so much imported food on the shelf. And I've lived in Jamaica, where there were times that there was just one brand of things on the shelf. And you know, this is something I've noted, that in Barbados, even during these last 10 years, you continue to see 5, 6, 10 brands of every item, imported brands of items on the shelf. And that in those periods, we could see a doubling of our food import bill as well. It speaks to the fact that Barbadians have continued to enjoy a certain lifestyle that they've perhaps had to tweak a little bit as they've tightened their belts. But certainly, you know, I mentioned last week that, you know, some of those folks from those countries come here expecting, when they hear of hardship in Barbados, expecting to relate it back to what Trinidad experienced in those years and what Jamaica experienced in those years, and coming here to realize that we really haven't had it like that. You can still go in our supermarkets and find a variety of everything that you want. And so, Madam President, it was late in coming, but we are here today to bring this act to provide for the imposition of a cess on these milk products. Also to add, Madam President, I did mention that at the time when the minister spoke in 2015 of the cess, he also mentioned the National Dairy Board, which I referred to earlier, that would have farmers and processors on it, but also a representative from the Ministry of Agriculture. And that they would monitor the cess, they would monitor the industry, but they would also be responsible for regulating the quota and the distribution of the cess. So where concerns were raised about how this money from the cess would then feed back to the industry, that would certainly be a key role for that particular National Dairy Board, Madam President. And so with all that being said, Madam President, I think that we are all in agreement that this cess is a good thing. It's been a while in coming, but better late than never. And so with that, Madam President, I would want to beg that this bill be read a second time.
Question is that this bill be now read for the second time. Honorable Senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. Accordingly, the bill has now been read for the second time.
Madam President, I beg to move that you do now leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 1 stand part.
Question is that Clause 1 stand part. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those honourable senators against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 2 stand part.
Question is that Clause 2 stand part. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those honourable senators against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 3.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 3 stand part.
The question is that Clause 3 stand part. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those honourable senators against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Clause 4.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 4 stand part.
The question is that Clause 4 stand part. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those honourable senators against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
The first schedule.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the first schedule be the schedule to the bill.
The question is that the first schedule be the first schedule to the bill. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those honourable senators against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
The second schedule.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill.
The question is that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those honourable senators against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that you do now report to Her Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to Her Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those honourable senators against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
His Honour has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee.
Madam President, I beg to move that this bill be read a third time.
Question is that this bill be now read for the third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, the ayes have it. Accordingly, the bill has now been read for the third time.
Madam President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Cess on Milk Act 2018.
Question is that this bill do now pass and be so cited. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, the ayes have it. Accordingly, the bill has now passed and shall be so cited.
Order number 2, ma'am. In the name of the Honorable Acting Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Income Tax Amendment Bill 2018.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Madam President. Just feeling a little disoriented with the sudden change of plans here. But Madam President, this matter that is now before us is an amendment to the Income Tax Act, Cap 73. The idea behind this amendment, Madam President, is to provide for a reverse tax credit of $1,300 from the income year 2017, so that those persons who would be affected would be able to take advantage of this reverse tax credit from April or anytime before April when they file their taxes. As we know, that season is upon us. And so this is for income year 2017, so that when the taxes are filed now in 2018, they would take advantage. But of course, the Act specifies that it is also for subsequent income years. It is not just for 2013. Madam President, this House is familiar with the reverse tax credit, and we've had in this administration to make certain amendments to this Income Tax Act as far as the reverse tax credit goes. In fact, Madam President, I do remember if I can go right back to 2008, 2009, when we did realize that there were challenges afoot with the economic crisis, Madam President. One of our main concerns, apart from managing the finances, apart from managing the economy, we had always realized that we would have, during this period, to take care of those more vulnerable during that period. And so, Madam President, one of the things that was done, and I do believe that the late Prime Minister David Thompson was with us at the time, and colleagues would correct me if I'm wrong, but I do remember that one of the first things we had done was actually increase that reverse tax credit. I believe it was around 2008, 2009. As I said, when we realized that there were going to be issues as far as the economy was concerned, we took a decision that one priority would have to be protecting those who were vulnerable. So we increased it then, Madam President. And then, Madam President, we came to 2013, I believe it is. Yes, we came to 2013. Madam President, as we all know, it was in 2013, around April, when we started to see a decline in the foreign exchange and other indicators as well of our financial situation. We had noticed that growth at that time was weak. But certainly I described in this chamber last week a graph that stays very vividly with me, and I also keep it on my phone as I speak to people about the things that we've had to face as a government in the last few years, was that decline from around April of 2013, and that decline continued right through to the end of 2013. In fact, as I look back, Madam President, when the financial statement and budgetary proposals in 2013 were done, that was in August of 2013. The minister had noted at the time that at April we had about 19 weeks cover, and by August there were just 16 weeks cover, and it was projected, and indeed it turned out to be, that by the end of that year there were just about 12.5 weeks cover in terms of our foreign exchange reserves. So at that period we started to see a decline, and so several measures were articulated in the financial statement and budgetary proposals of 2013 with the aim, of course, of cutting expenditure and also raising revenue, Madam President. And there were a couple of things that folks would remember that we did. In fact, it was at that time that we decreased the payment of the tuition fee as far as the university education goes. Again, this was in light of what was happening in the economy at that time. There was a temporary consolidation tax that was also applied, Madam President. There were reductions articulated in terms of transfers and subsidies to the Transport Board and NCC, UE, QEH, and so on, a cut in transfers, a 5% cut in goods and services. In fact, it was across the board. At that time, Madam President, there was also a decision made to decrease by 50% the reverse tax credit. The idea being, Madam President, that yes, across the board, everybody was going to share in these decisions that we had to make. And the burden essentially that we all bore to ensure that we were able to ride through those difficult periods. In fact, later that year, the National Insurance also articulated that for that year there also would not have been an increase in pensions. As we know, year on year, the National Insurance determines the increase in pensions, and at that time there was also no increase in pensions, so that everybody bore the burden, and everybody took some share of responsibility for getting us through that particularly rough period. As I said before, we are not at the end of our journey yet as far as this is concerned. We have come through some particularly rough periods, but we are on course, Madam President, and we are in the right direction. And as I said before, what we really just need now is some wind in our sails to get us moving, to get our growth accelerated. The priorities, as I said, included the vulnerable, so that even though we did cut the reverse tax credit, we cut it by 50%. We didn't remove it entirely because we know that that reverse tax credit really was an important fillip for the budgets and the households of the very vulnerable persons. Of course, members of the Senate would also remember that there were certain fundamentals as far as our program was concerned. All concerned said we wanted to maintain the peg of the Barbados dollar to the US, so we tried to do what we could to maintain that, and here we are today in 2018, and we have been able to achieve that, and it continues to be a priority for all our social partners, the private sector in particular, that we maintain that very precious peg that we have 2 to 1 to the US dollar. So we've tried to work around that. We also ring-fenced health and defense and security, and a couple of other key areas as well, realizing that in the long run you do yourself no favors if you actually slash those particular areas too heavily, because at the end of the day, if you slash health and if you slash your defense and security, the price that you will have to pay in the long run may be much too costly. So we did ring fence that. We also wanted to ensure that we minimize job losses, and so at that time there were no unemployment, there was no mention of retrenchments of jobs being lost, and we had worked with the private sector also. In fact, you would recall, Madam President, that from the time we came to office, we had worked with the private sector to ensure that together we maintain jobs. And so government held on to jobs and the private sector did likewise. And it was after we saw this decline in 2013, and we took these measures here in August of 2013, then we had to relook the situation. As we assessed where we were from these measures, we had to look at the situation again at the end of 2013 and realize that we needed to do something more, Madam President, in order to get us to target. And it was then that there was a retrenchment program, but again, Madam President, the idea behind that was to keep that to a minimum, to ensure that as much as possible, we kept as many jobs as we could. At that time, you would recall, Madam President, that there was a call for us to lay off 8,000, 10,000, all kinds of numbers of persons. But we also knew, again, just as I said with health and security, that slashing those numbers may cut your budget on the one hand, but then when you end up with a high unemployment figures, that you would actually end up with bigger problems in the society and bigger problems in your welfare and your other social sectors, Madam President. And so we tried to keep those numbers to a minimum. I think we ended up, after discussions with our partners in the union, we actually ended up at about 2,500 workers who were retrenched during that time. And of course, that was a one-off thing, and we have been able to continue to hold on to jobs during that time. So that, Madam President, at that point we saw the unemployment rise to about 12%, but then we've gradually seen it come back down now, so that unemployment is in the vicinity of 9–10%, Madam President. So we have had to take some tough choices along the way. But we are at a position now where, as I said, for the last few years, we've been able to record growth, not the kind of growth that we wanted, but we've been able to record growth so that we are now in a position that we could say, let us look at reversing the decision that we took on cutting the reverse tax credit. Madam President, initially when this reverse tax credit was done, as with several of the measures that were put in place, there was a specific time period. In fact, all of those measures that were articulated were to have been implemented over a 19-month period. And you would recall that we've been talking about our 19-month program. At the end of 19 months, it was assessed, and some of the the measures that we took were reversed as promised, and some of the measures we had to take the decision we need to hold on we need to keep these measures in place for a little while longer. And so it was in 2016, Madam President, that we took the decision that all the revenue-raising measures that were announced in the financial statement and budgetary proposals of 2013, the August statement, as well as the all those revenue-raising measures that were announced, Madam President, including the 50% reduction of the reverse tax credit. We went back to Cabinet, and it was determined that we would continue those for a little longer beyond that March 31st, 2016 deadline, with the exception of the consolidation tax and the tax on the assets of credit unions. And so, as I said, Madam President, we are now in a position to say that we can reinstate this reverse tax credit to the tune of $1,300. Remembering that before we came to office, it was $650, and it was this administration that pushed it up to $1,300. We cut it, and now we're raising it again, so that effective the income year 2017, there would be $1,300 that those persons who are affected can claim as their reverse tax credit. So that is what this legislation before this chamber is, Madam President. It is very simple. It just amends the necessary paragraph so that it now reads $1,300. And so, Madam President, I beg to move that this bill, with I'm sure, the long-awaited reinstatement of the 50% of the reverse tax credit, that this bill, Madam President, be now read a second time.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I rise to give full support to the passage of this income tax amendment bill in my brief contribution, and to fully associate myself with the views outlined by the move of this resolution, the incoming, soon-to-be Member of Parliament for St. George South, with the will of God and the support of the people in St. George South. Madam President, I am forced to rise because I was shocked to hear opposition spokespersons in the media, not in the Houses of Parliament where they should be, where they appear to be, trying to criticize this administration in this regard in terms of making a temporary reduction in the reverse tax credit during the period of economic hardship of the country. Because as Senator Barsuku mentioned in her presentation, it was this Democratic Labour Party administration, after assuming office in 2008, in the face of the global economic meltdown, high oil prices and so on, we still found the money to increase the reverse tax credit left by the Barbados Labour Party at $650. We increased it to $1,300, Madam President. So if the Barbados Labour Party was still in office, perhaps that $1,300 increase, that increase to $1,300 in the reverse tax credit may not have occurred, Madam President. Only the Almighty knows. But under the Democratic Labour Party administration, history will record that we, the Democratic Labour Party, increased the reverse tax credit to $1,300, Madam President. So I really ask the opposition to really wheel and come again, as it were. I think they forgot the facts, and that is why this Democratic Labour Party has launched a facts campaign in enlightening the public about the facts of the tremendous track record of our administration in the face of the trying economic challenges which the region, the world, and Barbados would have faced, Madam President. Madam President, this was not a one-off gesture, Madam President, as I will in a few minutes refer to a few other of the aspects of the social safety net which this Democratic Labour Party administration has championed over the years and certainly since assuming office in 2008, Madam President. And let me stress, Madam President, the importance of the reverse tax credit. It's a provision, Madam President, which helps to cushion the effects of regressive tax regimes in the form of indirect taxes, you know, including value-added tax in the case of Barbados, in some countries, and years ago in Barbados we had a sales tax. In other countries it's referred to as a consumption tax or GCT, general consumption tax. And these are distinct from the more progressive income tax, direct tax measures, where as one's income increases, the tax burden or the level of tax increases proportionately, Madam President. Whereas with the indirect tax, for example, VAT paid on an appliance or some clothing by an elderly person whose only source of income is a non-contributory old age pension is the same level of indirect taxation in the form of that paid by the richest person in the island purchasing that same item. So that illustrates the regressivity of indirect taxes, in that the impact of the indirect tax is felt more severely by the lower income earner than the higher income earner. So that is why caring government such as the Democratic Labour Party administration, who we've publicly stated we see the country as more than just an economy, but as a society, we care therefore about the vulnerable groups in our society, the indigent, the aged, the young, persons with disabilities, Madam President, who rely on the state to come up with creative schemes such as the reverse tax credit initiative to help them cushion the impact of various burdens, including taxation on their quality of life and their ability to survive, Madam President. So I'm very happy that this Democratic Labour Party administration did not, for example, cut or eliminate the reverse tax credit completely during the time of economic recession, because that was an option available. But we said no, this, you know, because some of the, you know, multilateral agencies and other groups, you know, would argue, well, maybe we can't afford that as a small, open, developing country and economy, Madam President. But we have always stuck to our guns in terms of our democratic socialist ideology within the Democratic Labour Party to ensure that we look out to support the vulnerable groups within our society. And that's why I say, Madam President, there's an ideological divide and difference between the more progressive Democratic Socialist Democratic Labour Party and the right-wing conservative Barbados Labour Party, Madam President. So, historically, when you look at the fact that it is this Democratic Labour Party administration that introduced fully taxpayer-funded education in secondary, at the secondary level. You understand that the late Right Excellent Walton Barrow, with the Democratic Labour Party assuming office in the general election of December 1961, told all the civil servants that he didn't want to hear any excuses, any reasons to delay the scrapping of school fees at secondary level, but by the January term of 1962, weeks or days after winning the general election in 1961, that the new Democratic Labour Party administration would abolish school fees at secondary school, and so said so done the Democratic Labour Party. And the Barbados Labour Party at that time was opposed to those sort of initiatives, as they were opposed to the introduction of the school meals program. As I understand it, they pledged that when they were to, if they were to assume office, they would punch the holes. Senator Hunt would remember that in the saucepans of the school meals program, Madam President. That is the conservative approach of the Barbados Labour Party to governance and government, Madam President. So on the eve of the general election, we urge the electorate to remember this. It is the same old soup warmed over when it comes to the Barbados Labour Party, Madam President. And we cannot run the risk of putting the reins of government in the hands of that conservative group who would then seek to turn back the clock in terms of the advancement, the social advancement of this country to the benefit of the masses of our country, Madam President. I too remember, Madam President, I'm just old enough to remember, as I said, born late December back in '63, that when I went to Lodge School in 1974, and that first year we were in the lower first because we took the, you know, what people used to call the screaming test, part 1 and then part 2. So we left primary school, I left Erdeston Model Mixed School, as we called it then, at age 10. So we went that first year of secondary school, we were in lower first, 74 to 75, and the textbook loan scheme was not in place as yet, Madam President. And I remember not being able, coming from a working class family, Madam President, not being able, as many of my colleagues at Lodge School at the time, we weren't able to buy all of the books on the book list, those big dictionaries and the big atlases and the science books, very expensive for us. And we had to go down to the late Captain Carol Mack. He ran the bookshop and see if he could find a tattered second-hand copy that we could afford, Madam President, if we were lucky. And sometimes, unfortunately, that edition was outdated and not the newest edition that the more affluent boys would be able to afford, Madam President. So your humble servant would have benefited directly from the Democratic Labour Party introducing the textbook loan scheme by the September of 1975, so that then the working class people like myself with, you know, tremendous ambition and intelligence would not be stifled by not having the economic means to purchase those textbooks. Thanks to the Democratic Labour Party, not the Barbados Labour Party, Madam President. And the list goes on. We introduced the, what you call it, the constituency councils, Madam President, in the first 10 months of my tenure as a Minister of Government. After assuming office in 2008, I was assigned as Minister of State in the Ministry of Social Care, where we led that process, Madam President. Went all over the island, weekend and after weekend, and some weeknights as well, all over the island, engaging the public in terms of town hall meetings. And the Barbados Labour Party at every turn opposed to this day the imposition of the introduction of the constituency councils. It brought governance closer to the masses, empowering residents in the various communities to be able to volunteer, to lift their communities up, and to ensure that they can make a more tangible contribution to the improvement of the infrastructure, be it road repairs, be it community classes to empower the unemployed persons to equip themselves to be able to earn income, Madam President. And of course, the constituency councils would have introduced the David Thompson Memorial Football Classic, which put money in the hands of those young people in Bush Hall, in St. Michael Northeast, and in Hoddesdale Turning in St. Michael Northeast, and Jackson and Jackman's, Madam President, in Green Hill, Spooner's Hill, Madam President. Those working class young men, we were able to provide them with opportunities to represent their respective, and Ellerton and other constituencies, represent their constituencies. St. Andrew, Madam President, when we saw at the finals those young men being hugged by the next representative for St. Andrew, Senator Irene Sandiford-Garner, with this love, this motherly love, Madam President, assisting those young men to stay out of negative behavior, but actually giving them income through the Constituency Council program, Madam President, that they could if they were unemployed, you know, give their children a little gift for Christmas or a little ham for the family for Christmas. Madam President, I'm just talking about this is part of the relevance is that this is part of the social safety net that the Democratic Labour Party administration introduced, and the Barbados Labour Party is promising they've opposed it from day one. So if the country were unfortunately decided to give them the reins of office, you know that all of that will go through the editors, as we say in Barbados. No more income for the vendors who make $1 at those football events, Madam President, if the Barbados Labour Party were to assume the reins of office, Madam President, after the next election. So I'm just outlining very frankly, Madam President, the implications of giving the government to the Barbados Labour Party. We shouldn't take these things for granted, Madam President, because this Democratic Labour Party administration cares about the vulnerable persons within the community, the youth, the unemployed, the persons who rely on the state for assistance. Because this Democratic Labour Party administration, as Senator Barsuku hinted at, we, since assuming office in 2008, actually increased the non-contributory old age pensions, Madam President, during that period, Madam President. So we care about working class people. And we can go on and on. The subsidize the free bus fares for the school children. The late David John Howard Thompson, as Prime Minister of Barbados, chairing our cabinet since assuming office in 2008, looked at the national security implications, saying we don't want those young school boys and girls being exposed on a daily basis to the negative criminal elements who may frequent those. I'm not saying all of them, but some people do in fact frequent that sort of sector, and exposing those children to those elements where they would be skipping school and riding up and down the island and parking out and so on, Madam President, when they should be at school. So we said take them away from that negative influence by allowing them free access to the transport board buses, Madam President. And that was again addressing the vulnerable, because when you have a working class family, you may have parents, grandparents, several children who have their little school children in, over a dozen people in a household. Sometimes you may have mothers having to send to school 3 or 4 children, Madam President, and if they had to pay that bus fare, some of the children would not be able to go to school every day. But thanks to the free bus fares for the school children of Barbados, they have been given that hand up, Madam President, by this Democratic Labour Party administration. And the Barbados Labour Party, to this day, ridiculed us for that and said it was a waste of time. So, if they were to assume office, that finished too, Madam President. Serious. That is why I encourage Barbadians to don't cop out and take the easy way out and say, oh, I'm confused, I'm not voting. The Barbados Labour Party supporters will come out. So the Democratic Labour Party supporters need to come out, because there are more Dems than Bs out there. Dr. Neville Duncan, the well-known political scientist, has made this point. But whenever there's a low turnout of voters, that is where the Democratic Labour Party would have challenges. So help us to help you, Dems. Come out in your numbers, support the Democratic Labour Party so that we can continue to look out for the masses of our country. I thank you.
Madam President, I rise to make a contribution. I better not qualify in terms of time, to make a contribution to this bill that is before the chamber. As I understand it, the gravamen of the submission here, especially if I am to follow the very last address, the gravamen of the contribution speaks to the commitment of the government, that is to say, the current administration, the commitment of the administration to those pledges, either in the form of manifesto or in the form of organizational and programming commitments that were made over time. And I am pleased to note the meticulous care that the government is demonstrating that it is making, has made, I should say, is making, and will continue to make to the stated commitments it has made, and indeed to the implied commitments which it has made. Particularly at this season, or we should say at the entrance to the open door of the park where the seasonal activities are likely to take place. Especially at this time, it would be useful for me, I can't speak for everybody, but for me, as having been closely associated with the Barbados Workers Union, and indeed with the aims and aspirations of working people in the private as well as in the public sector, it would be important for me to follow closely and to applaud the government where I see the need for such applause, but where I see that the government may be slacking somewhat in its exercise of energy to help to give it the little prod on or the little assistance that may be required to take the administration over the top. And that is what I intend to do in the moments that are before us. I note that having taken office in 2009, before 2009, that the government proceeded to increase that tax credit to $1,300, and that credit now will be available for those of us who are in that bracket, or for those persons, I should say of us, those persons who are in that bracket who will be filling in their tax returns starting in a few weeks' time. And that is something that I'm sure that they will be very pleased about, and I believe that we should all be very pleased about it, and that we should give kudos where kudos are due. I would want to do that myself because I recognize that the administration in 2009 was fully conscious that at the level of the International Labour Organization, we were all very concerned about the challenges and therefrom the impositions which would be placed on working class people, particularly coming out of the global economic and financial crisis with which we were all faced. I'm equally aware and would need to acknowledge that we all recognize that there was a need for a social safety net that would be put in place to treat with those who were the most vulnerable among our population in much the same way that other people who were among that group called them socially vulnerable in much the same way that they were being treated in several different administrations and jurisdictions. I recall only too well a very fine presentation which was made by Jamaica on the floor of the plenary conference of the ILO by the Jamaican Prime Minister at the time, and we were in Barbados also trying to work out our own approach to dealing with social platforms that would address this matter. While we may not have reached the same levels, I'm satisfied that we were concerned with the levels of commitments, and it's to that that I again would wish to draw your attention, Madam President, because this measure before the Senate is a measure that speaks to the government's intention to honor the commitment. Because I'm speaking to that, I have to to state that I'm conscious that part of that commitment by the government, part of that stated commitment by the government, and part of what I understand to have been the implied commitment of the government was the intention to make adjustments to wages and salaries in the public service. And I'm grateful that we have addressed this subject as it speaks to the matter of commitment within the public service. And thereby it gives me the opportunity, while remaining true to the subject of the discussion, to make some observations. Because we are conscious, I am, and I'm sure, Madam President, that you are too. Because I am conscious and we are conscious of that commitment to address wages and salaries, and because we are also very conscious of the commitment of the government to revisit the Statutory Board's Pensions Act, particularly to include the Barbados Transport Board workers, so that they no longer find themselves as being one of two of all the statutory boards that we have that do not benefit from pensions in the public service. Because I'm aware of that, and because the government has made it absolutely clear of its commitment to those areas in the weaknesses in the public service to which it is committed, then I would need to suggest that as we explore this particular bill and the implications within the bill, that we would widen the submission that will be made out of this particular bill to make sure that we move with alacrity to honor, and to honor now and not tomorrow, to honor now those public servants' commitments to which I have made reference just a few moments ago. And the matter of the pensions adjustment, when the minister involved in transport indicated that discussions were going on between himself and the Ministry of the Attorney General, we were made aware that there was a clear understanding that all that was necessary would be limited adjustments to be made to the Pensions Act, the relevant Pensions Act, to bring the Transport Board workers in line. And that was made not merely to the leadership of the Barbados Workers Union, but it was made as a subject clear to the workers at the Transport Board, who were in large numbers sitting, as it were, at his feet, and being very happy to hear directly from a minister of the Crown that commitment which was being made early in January of this year. And I would believe that there is time. I'm sure that there's the goodwill, and I'm sure that all of us in this chamber would want to do the necessary aiding, adjusting, helping, and prodding that will be necessary to bring this about. And the other matter, the matter of the wages, I'm aware that government itself has spoken at some stage or another to what I think is referred to by one of the sister unions that we have as a coping subsidy. And I'm aware that in this chamber, not so very long ago, we had some discussions by the leaders of the Senate to the questions of increases tied to productivity. And while I do not wish to go back into any of those or to make reference to the speakers that were involved in making those commitments, I would wish merely to talk about the matter from the perspective that so far we have only had words. statements that are words. And I don't want to be negative in reference to words or to singers who speak about words and how easy it is for them to be spoken. So far there are words, but we think there need to be negotiations. And I would wish to say in that regard that the government has demonstrated this commitment and the willingness to abide by commitments, because I think that I should say publicly that we are pleased to note that at least there have been not merely words that have been spoken regarding public sector appointments. There have been a plethora of announcements and a series of satisfied people who have been able to receive letters indicating their appointments to several departments within the public service. And I am pleased to note the level of satisfaction that there continues to be in the public generally, as well as in this noble chamber. And I want to say that that needs to continue. In the post office for clerical workers, for example, we need to see that. In those areas where the discussions are not quite finished, as with the Barbados Revenue Authority and the Customs Department of that, we need to see that finished, and finished now, because we wouldn't want to have things overhanging while we are getting ready to walk into the park for the excitement of the coming extravaganza that will be facing us. We would prefer to enter into that park without the baggage of these matters with which we might be confronted, and not all of us might have the same approach to what has been committed and what has been presented up to now. We are saying yes, we are grateful. We know that there's more, and therefore we are looking forward to having that which is more to come and to come now, rather than to be in any promises that may be made from elevated platforms while we are in those parks. So let us address those matters, and let us address them as urgently as we can. I note that Senator Todd, please forgive me, I'm elevating you to comradeship. I know that Senator Todd made reference to the social safety net which there was established and which we are all still working towards, and that he has been very pleased that the government, even in the difficulties of the period after the crisis hit us, that the government has been pleased to treat with a number of those areas where people may have fallen through the nets or through the cracks in the Barbados environment. And I, like him, note that, and I note that we have been able, in the labor movement, against severe difficulties, we've been able to try to get the private sector to work with us to look at part of that social floor and to look at the adjustments which are necessary if we are going to advance the people. We note, for example, that the United Kingdom, and I don't want always to make reference to them, but I need to look at areas where people who have been faced with the same problem of the social safety floor and the need for that safety net, to see what they have been doing. And I look at two approaches which are being taken there. The minimum wage, which was legislated and imposed in Great Britain. And we spoke to that in this chamber some years ago when I drew, some months ago, when I drew to the chamber's attention the fact that the United Kingdom had moved ahead to increase, even though there were difficult times, to increase the minimum wage. Now, I'm pleased to see that we have moved partly in the direction of that commitment by having the minimum wage board set up, but I believe that twixt the cup and the lip, there may very well be many a slip. In fact, if I put it correctly, I'd say there's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip. That's putting it correctly. And what I am suggesting here is that between the establishment of the Minimum Wages Board and the need to establish a minimum wage, too many months have passed, and that there is need for us to address that matter beyond the commitment of the minister, and we need to be able to put something in place, because if Senator Todd is correct, it may very well be that there may be some happenings down the road which may prevent the programs where commitments have been made by his particular body of administration. There may be things that might happen to prevent us from being able to move ahead with the program, the social program of the disenfranchised and of those who are socially vulnerable. And so, because tomorrow may be too late, because we can't speak into the future, we want to hear about now what is happening in regard to minimum wages in terms of the private sector. And we want to hear about what is happening in terms of a wages agreement in the public sector. And I gave the one example so far of what is happening or what happened in Great Britain. And then to balance across the Atlantic, I would have to speak to what is happening, it appears accidentally, in the United States of America, where although there were commitments to minimum wages are taking place, but as an offshoot, an ad hoc arrangement coming out of the various measures, particularly tax measures that have been imposed in that particular place. Now, I am not too concerned about those that are referred to by Mr. Buffett, where it seems as though his minimum wage got increased by $28 billion. I said billion, as in bus. Billion. I'm not speaking to that, but I'm speaking to wages of those who are poor and who are in need of adjustments. So I don't want to compare what is happening nearer in the Atlantic. I want to rather to look to what is happening further afield, where the socialists inclined are ready to recognize that those particularly at the lowest end of the economic scales have got to have adjustments in their wages from time to time. Yes, Madam President, I appreciate that government has been battling with the equation. Should we go the route of wages? And if we do that, what happens on the other side of the equation with the matter of jobs? And I think that most people in Barbados have understood that that has been the kind of challenge with which we have been confronted for quite some time. And I think that it is fair to say that when it came to crunch time, it is because trade unions and their memberships have recognized that there is always the question of that dichotomy of interest, that there have not been other than a call for negotiations. Now, I can't speak for anyone at this time in these matters, but what I am prepared to say is that what I would think that we are looking at, I for one am looking at, is the fact that if you have a matter that is before us, if you have a matter that is before the nation, however difficult that matter is to be resolved or to resolve, you have to treat it from the point of view of your last statement in principle. If you don't treat with the principle, then you're missing the bus. And the position of principle, as I understand it, was a commitment by the government to have wage negotiations following the 3 months period immediately after the National Social Responsibility levy was imposed on the country. In short, after September. I am not stating what should have been the outcome of those deliberations. I think that reasonable people meeting and speaking reasonably with one another ought to be able to arrive at reasonable conclusions when once they examine what the factors are. And I argue that there is therefore no good reason why there should not be negotiations being conducted for and on behalf of the workers in the public sector. And I make that statement without making any judgment regarding what the outcome of the negotiations would be. I think that a commitment was made, the same commitment that led the leaders in this debate to make reference to what the government is trying to do. The commitment was made, and that commitment was that we will look to see the extent to which we are prepared. And there was not a talk about a scoping or coping or any fees. There was a matter of discussion, of negotiations for a wage adjustment. If that has to be done by having a sliding scale, if it has to be done by saying we can't in year 1, but we could in year 2, if it has to be done by whatever methodology, my argument is that the history of labor management relations in Barbados demonstrates that where negotiations are held in good faith, that a resolution is always possible. And one last thing regarding this matter of commitment. I think that the government, in its commitment, has indicated that it is quite willing to enter into a program of full respect for all the workers of Barbados, and that it will commit government departments at the levels of statutory boards and ministries of government to have that commitment done. What government has not done is to ensure that appropriate legislation is brought to this chamber to ensure that employers, many of whom are beneficiaries of agreements and partnerships with the government, that employers in the private sector would stop denying workers their right to join the trade union movement. Until now, I have not called names because I'm not going to get permission if I ask those employers. But I know that we have a number of employers who are using several real outlawish, cowboy outlawish tactics to avoid respecting workers' rights to negotiate, whether they are in security, whether they are in people who have buildings that relate to the Barbados Water Authority, and I'm coming as close to calling a name as I intend to on this occasion. We have the same problem, and I wish to say that if we want to have a period free from industrial unrest so that the extravaganza that I spoke about in the part that we're going to look at can take place without industrial dislocation, that the government has today and not tomorrow to speak to those supermarkets, to speak to those security companies, to speak to those companies in construction that have significant benefits that they derive from government by contracts, to make sure that we are no longer in a position where we have either to get recognition or to shut down the country. I think that at this period, the government can further demonstrate its commitment to a program of cooperation, a program where we are able, or where the government is able, I'm not part of that, of the government, so I can't say we, where the government is able to demonstrate that it is in partnership with the electorate and that it will pledge to the electorate what the electorate wants to be able to engage in honorable, decent, and noble relationships for the ongoing improvement of our nation. And so I would suggest, Madam President, that a word to the government at this time is, as always, like a word to the wise. That should be sufficient.
Just you?
Thank you very much, Madam President, and I want to thank my colleagues for their support in this bill that is before us, this bill to look at the reverse tax credit. If I could speak on what the last intervention, Madam President, that was made by Senator Sir Roy Trotman, where he spoke, and somehow we managed to weave. You know, I started by saying how I love these Senate sessions, how they're so always relevant and educating, and then up comes my colleague and starts with and segues very nicely into commitments, which really had nothing to do with the bill that is before us. But Sir Roy, Madam President allowed it, so therefore, what can I say? But just to say that certainly on the matter of wage adjustments, of course, we all agree. I think certainly everyone on this side, and I believe all of us in this chamber, agree that it is time for a wage adjustment, but that we also know that within the constraints that we are operating now, that these have to be negotiated. However, as Sir Roy did say, there was a commitment given that after the NSRL had been in place for about 3 months, that negotiations would begin. I am advised, I'm not a part of those negotiations because the civil service issues don't come under the Ministry of Labor as would those in the private sector. I am advised that the Ministry of the Civil Service and other relevant authorities have begun negotiations. They have been looking at that matter. But I must also remind, and Sir Roy did it too, that along with that, we have decided, and Sir Roy mentioned it, we have started the process of the appointments, because we do know that that is also important for the lives of those public servants. Public servants, we know of some who've been working for 10 years or more in temporary positions. And of course, when you are in a temporary position, you are not able to go to the bank and say, I need a loan for a car, I need a loan for education, I need to change my roof, things like that. And so that security that we would give them through appointment will certainly allow them to have that leverage, that they can do those things that they would not otherwise have been able to do. It is not a wage increase, we know, and we do agree that we have to get to the position of wage increase. And while there is willingness, while there's political will, of course it takes more than will to be able to pay these wage increases. But the negotiations are continuing. I must also advise that yes, I understood the reference to the trade union legislation, and I do know that that has been on the legislative agenda for the Ministry of Labor for some time now, that also requiring the tripartite discussion that all our labor legislation would be subject to, that trade union legislation being the legislation that allows workers to be able to join a union and to associate with a union, because we do know that what we are seeing now is that unless it is expressly stated in legislation that there are employers who are not allowing their workers to join a union. Even though we do have for example, clauses in the Employment Rights Act that would say that, for example, you can't dismiss a worker because he or she belongs to a trade union or works with a trade union or represents other workers on behalf of a trade union, things like that. We are still seeing that there are employers that are not allowing their unions, their workers to associate. And so that certainly has, that scenario has been one of the things that has driven the very aggressive pursuit of labor legislation in my ministry over the last few years. The fact that employers, unless they see it in black and white, and certainly too we're seeing it even more so with employers representing foreign companies and companies based overseas, where they're not seeing it in black and white. They're not concerned with our custom and practice as would have happened for decades. And so over the last few years, we've had to pursue aggressively new legislation and amendments to legislation so that it is there in black and white. I'm advised that companies investing in Barbados, they comb our legislation, make sure that they understand what their commitments are, and labor legislation is certainly one such legislation. And so it is on our radar. In fact, it is on our front burner at the Ministry of Labor, Social Security and Human Resource Development, because we do know that it is still quite relevant. The matter of the minimum wage, yes, we have now established the minimum wage board, but you would remember that along with those other things that we did, as part of the social safety net, we had increased the minimum wage. I believe that was around 2012, we increased the minimum wage. There was a proposal on the table to increase the minimum wage by a lot more, and right now the figures are escaping me, but we had a proposal to increase the minimum wage, but again, as we discussed with our tripartite partners, it was decided, well, let's not go right to the full amount that we wanted to increase it by, and so we said we would do it in 2 phases. So we did the first increase, which employers agreed, okay, they can manage, because we too had that discussion with the private sector employers, that should we increase the minimum wage too much too soon, then certainly in the private sector, we would see massive layoffs. And that was something that we wanted to, that is something that we wanted to avoid. It was certainly nothing we wanted to be responsible for. And what we agreed to was that we would increase the minimum wage in 2 steps. And we did increase it then, and that was then before 2013, 2014, when we started to have even further difficulties in the economy. But I think the time is right now that we can get back to the table to have those discussions on that second phase. And with the help and the support of the Minimum Wage Board, I think we would be well guided, and we should be able to conclude this second round of negotiations a lot more easily. I mentioned that the increase in minimum wage was a part of our social safety net, and I just want to remind, for the record, for those who are hearing, that we mentioned a couple of the things, that when we did realize that we were going to have difficulties, that it was this administration that determined we had to look out for the vulnerable. And so yes, we did start the negotiations, and we did implement a minimum wage at that time. We also did the $10 million in the retraining fund, because we agreed that more than just having the unemployment benefit, which you will recall we also increased. We increased the time for the unemployment fund. At the start of the crisis, we increased the unemployment benefit, which is usually 26 weeks. We carried that up to 40 weeks. And we did that for a period until we realized then that the National Insurance Fund could not sustain that increase for much longer, because that was a full 14 weeks we increased it by. And then we did have to go back to the 26 weeks. But we increased that unemployment benefit. We added we did the retraining fund. We capitalized that retraining fund so that those persons who were unemployed would now also be able to retool and reskill and have new opportunities for themselves, rather than sitting at home. Indeed. Rather than waiting for that job that they had before, or one similar to it, to open up, they would have opportunities. They would be able to increase their opportunities. And so we allowed for the retraining fund, and there have been a lot of people who have taken advantage. It was slow going at first because the concept didn't seem to resonate, especially with persons in their 40s and 50s, but it did start to accelerate. And we have a lot of people now who are in brand new careers because they took advantage of that retraining fund and went on to make a new living for themselves, essentially. I mentioned the reverse tax credit. We also increased the pensions. I think Senator Todd mentioned that we did increase the pensions at that time. We reduced the bus fares. We actually eliminated the bus fares for school children also to ensure that, while he also mentioned the security issue, it was also to ensure that we did not find ourselves in a situation where school children would be sitting around at home because they didn't have the bus fare to get to school. And so that was another decision that we took. And I must mention that as a part of all of this, the summer camps. And I remember Senator Lawrence, indeed, those summer camps were also a way of ensuring that during the long summer holidays, parents would be able to have support for their children. Their children would get a meal every day because we knew that in the summer holidays, it becomes very difficult to feed your children. And so it was in the crisis that we started the camps, so that children would be able to be taken care of. Parents could get out to work and not have to juggle that responsibility. Do I stay home with the child? What do I do? Children could be safe, well looked after, and get a meal as well. So that was another plank in our social protection platform, Madam President. And of course, we did pursue, even in the crisis, very aggressively, our Housing Every Last Person program. And there are others, but that's all I'll mention at this time, Madam President. Of course, I have to mention that program because it is under that program, and indeed with the rent to own being added as part of that Housing Every Last program, that I certainly have been able to see 51 houses in Greens, and persons from St. George South getting houses in Greens. So, Madam President, this, as Soroy did say, Senator Soroy, is a commitment that the government has to not only ensure that we came back to the table and looked at the reverse tax credit, but that we continue to look after the vulnerable. Bearing in mind that it is this administration that always believes, as has been said before, and we've said it all through this session of the Senate, and so I think at this point I'll say it again, that it is this administration that believes that we are more than an economy. And at the end of the day, it is what kind of society we make for ourselves that is important. And we certainly have to be the kind of society where we look out for the weakest among us. That has to be the hallmark of any great society. That is the kind of society that we are creating. A Barbados that is socially balanced, economically viable, and environmentally sound, and of course characterized by good governance, as we have seen demonstrated over the last 5 years, Madam President. And with that, Madam President, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time. Madam President, I beg to move that you do now leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1. Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 1 stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 stand part. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those honourable senators against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Clause 2. Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 2 stand part.
The question is that Clause 2 stand part. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those honourable senators against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I beg that you do now report to Her Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to Her Honour President, the passing of one bill in committee. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Honourable senators against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
His Honour has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee.
Madam President, I beg to move that this bill be read a third time.
Question is that this bill be now read for the third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. Accordingly, the bill has now been read for the third time.
Madam President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Income Tax Amendment Act 2018.
Question is that this bill do now pass and be so cited. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. Accordingly, the bill has now passed and shall be so cited. Senator Sandifer Garner, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, this amendment is based on, well, I'm going to give the background, a meeting which the Minister of Tourism would have had with the Minister of Finance would have had with members of the Barbados Hotel and Tourism Association way back in 2014, where they would have requested a meeting to discuss the fact that they were having difficulties accessing the benefits from the VAT concessions which the government would have instituted in 2013. The VAT Amendment Act 2013, Section 7 Cap 87, would have instituted a law which allowed a 7.5% VAT payable on the supply of accommodation in a guest house, a hotel, or inn, or any other similar place, including a dwelling house, normally let or rented to persons for use as a vacation or holiday home. The reduced VAT also applied to entertainment, other than entertainment supplied by a promoter of public entertainment, including theatrical performances, films, exhibitions, dinner shows, and other performances. Cruises, other than international cruises, goods and services related to sports and recreation, goods and services provided at marinas, spas, retreats, conference facilities, meals, drinks, and dining services. So, Madam President, there are a plethora of areas where concessions were provided, including attractions, and I would have spoken about attractions last week in our estimates debate when I called for the private sector to invest more in the product Barbados. And to give an example of the fact that attractions in this country are needed, our own attraction, which is run by the government, Caves of Barbados, Madam President, saw a 12% increase in business last year over the same period in 2016, which worked out to about 12,446 more visitors to the cave, Harrison's Caves of Barbados. And that works out again to like a 15.6% increase in visitors to that one attraction, which tells Barbados that the market for tourist attractions is ripe for exploration. The market for tourist attractions is ripe for exploration. This is one attraction which attracted 12,000 people more than it did the year before. The original act also stipulated that the registrant had to be registered with or have a license from the Barbados Tourism Product Authority, the Barbados Hotel and Tourism Association, Inc., and Small Hotels of Barbados. You had to be in compliance with your statutory obligations, meaning your VAT, your NIS, and your land tax, as well as your income tax. And you had to demonstrate to the satisfaction of the Controller of Customs that 75% of the money which you earned was earned in foreign currency. Now, that was the clause which caused some confusion or concern, because during that meeting in May, many of the business people said that the fees paid to them were paid in Barbados money at point of delivery, so that when they received those payments, it was registered, or the payment would be registered as Barbados currency. And the banks had no methodology of tracking the foreign exchange transactions which they would have put through. So sourcing adequate proof to support that criteria was very difficult for them. After their presentation, the minister agreed to delete that clause and instead insert a line to require that the registrant had a license from the Barbados Tourism Product Authority, the BHTA, Small Hotels of Barbados, Inc., and that they were in compliance with their VAT, income tax, NIS, and their land tax. So he substituted that clause for a combined paragraph to ask for those requirements. Madam President, it is my opinion that the expansion of the Hotel Platinum in Barbados, the room stock as we call it, and the flurry of new restaurants which we have seen come into play in the past 5 years can be attributed to the concessionary regime which Barbados would have introduced, this government would have introduced. During the debate last week, I spoke about the tourism industry being an export product, and I spoke about concessions being an investment. Well, we can clearly see, Madam President, that that investment is now bearing fruit. We have seen that the U.S. market has outpaced the British market in tourism arrivals. And my colleague earlier, colleague Hunt, spoke about the advent of sandals and the controversy and dissatisfaction which some local business persons would have expressed about the advent of sandals, not looking at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture was that sandals provided marketing for this country that we could not have bought. He spoke about the full-page advertisements, the television advertisements, and the global recognition that Barbados would have recognized from the advent of sandals. Well, no, Madam President, the numbers speak for themselves, because besides the marketing, which we would have done as an entity, meaning the Ministry of Tourism and the Barbados Tourism Marketing, Inc., credit has also to be given to the fact that we would have had a brand name property in Barbados engaging in their own marketing. And that is the relevance and importance of this country having brand name hotels in the island. Brand name hotels like Wyndham, which is now developing Sam Lars Castle, have their own market, and they also have their own marketing reach and clout, and they have global recognition. And Hyatt is also a property with global marketing reach and clout. And that is why this government is insistent and determined that we have that brand name hotel here on Bay Street. So as I said, the investment was made and we're seeing the returns, and we are the recipients of the effect of the marketing clout which those brand names have. We also have a number of hotels currently refurbishing and expanding in this country, which are, some are locally owned and some are foreign owned. The Sands Hotel Condo, that's a $20 million investment, 153 units, 200 employees. You have Seabreeze Hotel, adding 44 rooms, and employing 40 more Barbadians. You have the Accra Beach at Enterprise, a 44-room boutique hotel, employing 50 persons. Sam Lords, which is a $200 million investment, 19.7 million has already been spent here in Barbados, on island, hoping to employ 1,000 persons. The Hyatt is a $200 million investment. Sandals Beach Haywoods, 550 rooms, and that is a $400 million investment. And Madam President, I'm speaking about projects which are ongoing. These are not projects in the pipeline. These are projects ongoing. Pure Beach at Foul Bay, 309 rooms, $300 million. They've received their town plan approval and they're now ready to go. They will be employing 400 persons. And Bay Street is looking at a 150-room hotel, which is a $220 million project with 200 employees. So, Madam President, the consultation and the subsequent amendment which we have brought tonight have borne fruit. And with that, Madam President, I beg that this bill be read a second time.
Senator Lady Haynes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. And let me thank Senator Irene Sandifer Garner for that introduction. Let me begin by saying Harrison's Caves is, I would have to say, one of the best attractions I have seen, not in Barbados, but anywhere. I've been several times, going back maybe 20 years ago, but I was there over Christmas with some guests who were here from overseas, and I couldn't believe how it gets 10 in every category. It is really excellent, and I congratulate the government and the people who manage the caves for an excellent job. But Madam President, I live on the South Coast, and so I am certainly, I rise to support this bill, but I rise also in the context of that and tourism on the South Coast, just to put my concerns on the table. There are a lot of challenges now for businesses on the South Coast. As I was coming today on Golf Club Road, there was a whole line of traffic, and I asked myself, what is causing this traffic? There's got to be a funeral or something. And then I realized, because I've heard it people say it on the radio, that people are now using Golf Club Road so as to get away from the coast road. And if I say so myself, I do the same thing. There are a lot of businesses on that South Coast Road. We've all seen the pictures of the sewage, and there are many businesses that have closed over the past few months. Today I heard that Scotiabank has closed temporarily. Every day it seems there's another business, and several of the businesses report like a 50% reduction in their business over the last few months with the sewage problems. It's a huge, of course, a public health concern. And Madam President, I have huge sympathies for the ministries that are involved, because this is clearly a significant problem. But what I think businesses probably need are some directives, some information coming out from the ministries that they can give their clients or their tenants or their guests, so that there's something that says, this is what we are doing, this is the water is a big concern, of course, and I'm not sure whether it's being done, but I would make a plea for water testing to be offered to accommodation places, people that offer accommodation, business houses, so that they can say to their staff or their guests, we have tested our water and we are comfortable that there's no bacteria in the water. I think that's important. I think if we could I know it's difficult to give time frames. I've heard about the immersion wells that are being done, and I am sure this is very, very challenging to give time frames, but I think for businesses, for tourists, for residents, I think people would be a lot more comfortable if some kind of broad assurances, guidelines could be given as to what the expectations are. So, as I say, Madam President, I fully support this bill, but with these concerns that I have regarding tourism and business on the South Coast. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator Boyce, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to support this amendment to the Value-Added Tax Act as well. Madam President, it gives me a great amount of joy to see what is happening now in the expansion of tourism. We didn't blow a trumpet 4 years ago to talk about what it is we wanted to see done. In respect to tourism, we wanted to make sure that we got the train going and that we were reaching some of the places we wanted to reach. Madam President, has been our view, and Minister of Tourism and I have had many discussions on the matter. What would we do? How would our unemployment go if we were to double? And I think Senator Byron Saku has heard me with this, wondering out loud in various places. What would happen if we were to double our room stock in this country with the appropriate quality hotels, the appropriate brand names, which, quite apart from giving you market reach, also give you airlift support? Because if you've got a Sandals or Marriott's or whatever out there, the airlines will pay you a lot more attention to giving you the airlift. And you don't have to spend as much money then to get the airlift here. But notwithstanding, when we spent some money to get some additional airlift into the country, did the incentives. Madam President, I haven't looked at the numbers closely recently, but I believe that the tourism industry employs directly somewhere around between 13,000 and 14,000 people. And if we could double our room stock, maybe we could see another 10,000, 12,000 jobs becoming available. I don't mean to double our room stock in any 20 years. I think we have to aim to double it in not more than 8 years from now. And make sure that we get the airlift to bring it in. And Madam President, if you can get 12,000 direct jobs, you probably get another 12,000 indirect jobs. Or that would give us 20,000 jobs or whatever. Let us say we get 2,000 jobs a year, more jobs per year, or 3,000 more jobs per year for the first few years. Our labor force isn't growing by anything near those numbers. And that's why we wanted to push this tourism industry. And then to push with the links to the rest of the economy, the telecommunications, the finance, the transportation industry, the food industry, the handicraft industry, and so on. And with the increase in the hotel, in the room stock, in the airlift, in the occupancy, in the spend, and the quality of the properties, we're talking much more business for our restaurants. Increasing the number of restaurants, improving the profitability of the existing ones, and bringing in some new ones as well. And what has happened in the last few years in tourism has really been part of that strategy, which has been unfolded, which has begun to reap the results for us, and which I think will continue. I am all for a diversified economy, but you have to take advantage of your competitive strengths. We have a competitive strength in tourism, and we should take every advantage of it and make sure then that we, having got the tourists here and got the hotel room stock, that we make the proper links with the rest of the community, and that the whole country is able to benefit from that and carry some of the visitors down in that wonderful part of the country, which Senator Roy remarked earlier on today. And I forgot to say that the good Senator Critchlow came from that area as well. His family came from that area as well, right over the sea. So Madam President, this change in the VAT Act is not a big change in terms of legislation, but it's very important for those industries, those that support the tourism industry, and make what we have in Barbados something that people want to come to and enjoy. I know we have the difficulties on this, of course, and believe me, we're trying to do everything that we can to get it resolved. I think it was last week, the House, at a place, last week before last, they passed a supplementary resolution to provide money immediately for the Water Authority to be able to get the injection wells done and the bypass put in place so as to relieve the problem and put us at a stage where we can actually look at doing a proper permanent fix on the system. But that money was passed in the lower house. I believe the work, they began to mobilize the equipment and so on, and we're not looking for it to be a long process, because we know it has to get done and it has to get solved as soon as possible. So I'm very hopeful that will get sorted out. We know as well as the rest of the country that we've got too much at stake to let it wait, and the technical people at the Water Authority and the Environmental Protection Department, the Ministry of Health, all of them, they're working round the clock to try to get this problem resolved. And every week we have an extensive discussion on it and try to make sure that whatever resources that are required, whatever support that they need, we provide it to them. So, and I live near the South Coast as well. My daughter lives even nearer than me, and that is very important for me. My daughter and my grandchildren. So, you know, when it comes to grandchildren, you know how that tugs at your heartstrings. So, we're very concerned about it. So we're working on that. I want to assure you. And we're not going to let up until we get the problem solved. Not only temporarily, but solved in a permanent way. Because we need to, if the system needs to be doing, we'll have to redo the system. And that is the commitment, I believe, that we've taken in the government of Barbados on that matter. So, Madam President, I'm happy to see Senator Garner and Minister Mr. Seeley doing so well with the tourism industry, and I want to see them go from strength to strength with this industry. Maybe double the industry in 5 years more under the current administration.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you, Madam President. I support.
Senator Sandiford Garner, you have the floor.
As I stand to wrap up this debate, thank you very much, Madam President. As I stand to wrap up, I'd like to thank my colleague for his kind words. Our achievements have not been attained without some blood, sweat, no tears. And little money. The little money caused a lot of blood and sweat. But I think, Madam President, it has been an enlightening experience, because we learned to do much with little, which meant we relied on our brains and our wits to achieve the objectives which we set out every year to achieve. And I am pleased to have been associated with this level of success. I would have worked in the Ministry of Health before from 2010 to 2012, where we would have reorganized the drug formulary and taken a lot of hard decisions there too, with the accident emergency and so on. But throughout it all, Madam President, we've had some very tough civil servants and ministers to work with, meaning that we were not afraid to make the tough decisions. And I'm pleased that tourism has seen the fruit of our labors. The tourism industry in Barbados now stands on a very solid platform. I am not going to say it's about to take off. It has taken off. the numbers have shown that it has taken off and it can only soar in the future, Madam President. And to my colleague, Senator Lady Haynes, I understand and I empathize with your concerns. There is no Barbadian who does not. I think it's even harder as a business person to have to face the steadily declining numbers and have to explain to your customers what is happening on the South Coast. The situation is a situation which we have been faced with based on what would have occurred prior. We are now well aware that it was a hastily constructed and financially deficient system which has chosen at this time to collapse. And I do believe that probably we could benefit from a little more engagement, as Lady Haynes would have said, because as a resident and as a business person, it is very obvious that there is a gap in the communication. Minister Boyce spoke about the intense discussions which take place every week on the matter, and probably we could have some communication to the business persons every week on the level of discussions and the content of those discussions. Now, that is not a job which can be done by an ordinary spokesperson or a technical person. I do believe, and I'm just making this suggestion now on the spot, that probably Barbados Water Authority could benefit from a trained crisis manager who is skilled in communication, who can come and there are people who are crisis communicators, and I'm sure there's one in Barbados who could probably come on board in this situation, which is a national crisis, and communicate with those affected on a weekly basis and act as a buffer between the affected and the state, so that there's a clear channel of communication, there's no misunderstandings, and there's no miscommunication, because we're seeing a lot of that as well. And what is disappointing is that some media houses are quoting people who have sometimes some cloudy facts, but who have access to the airwaves, and they're being heard rather than us hearing from those who are qualified to speak and whose interest is solely in seeing that this situation is managed and managed well. So that is a suggestion that I would wish to put out here, that we have a buffer between the state and the affected persons, and that person can be a person trained in crisis management and communication in crisis situations. And I think that that would indeed serve us well on both sides. So, Madam President, with that said, I again beg that the bill be read a second time.
Question is that this bill be now read for the second time. Honorable Senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, the ayes have it. Accordingly, the bill has now been read for the second time.
Madam President, I beg that you do now leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into committee.
Question is that I do now leave the chair and the Senate resolves itself into committee. Honorable Senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, the ayes have it. Accordingly, I do now leave the chair and the Senate resolves itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Mr. Chairman, I beg that Clause 1 stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 stand part. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those honourable senators against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Mr. Chairman, I beg that Clause 2 stand part.
The question is that Clause 2 stand part. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those honourable senators against, please say no. think the ayes have it.
Report.
Mr. Chairman, I beg that you do now report to the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to her Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those honourable senators against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Thank you. President, I beg to report the passing of one bill in committee.
No problem, thank you. Okay.
Madam President, I beg that the bill be read a third time.
Question is that this bill be now read for the third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, the ayes have it. Accordingly, the bill has now been read for the third time.
Madam President, I beg that this bill do now pass and be cited the Value Added Tax Amendment Act 2018.
Question is that this bill do now pass and be so cited. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, the ayes have it. Accordingly, the bill has now passed and shall be so cited.
Well, Madam President, that brings us to the end of public business for today. In fact, I am advised by the clerk that that brings us to the end of public business, the end of business in the Senate likely for this session, that it is unlikely that we shall return for what is left of the session. And therefore, Madam President, as I rise on the adjournment, allow me please to take this opportunity to say heartfelt thanks to all those persons who have made this session a success. Madam President, I've had the privilege of sitting in the other place and being here. And while I do aspire to be back in the other place, please don't take that personally, Madam President. I have thoroughly enjoyed my term here in the Senate. I have learned so much. It has been a truly educational experience for me. In fact, I think I benefited from the time here and from the interaction with all the senators. I've learned so very much from all of them. Madam President, this session would not have been possible. It would not have been the success that it was without your expert guidance. And I first want to thank you for so expertly taking us through the last 5 years. You have been, it has been an honor to work so closely with you these last 5 years. And if I may say so, your leadership has been truly inspirational, Madam President. And to all those in the Senate that I've worked with, all those on the government side, all the independent senators, the opposition senators in their absence, I want to thank all of them for their contributions, for the level of debate. I don't know if it's the rarefied air a couple of feet above the other place, but certainly the level of contribution, the level of debate here has been sterling. And I want to thank all of the senators for their contributions over the years, Madam President. Of course, we have to thank the marshals, the clerks, Madam President, the deputy clerk, or police officers who have sat in attendance. Sometimes, Madam President, I even find myself being energized as I make eye contact with the police here as they get engaged and involved in the discussion that we are having here. And we thank them for their presence, certainly making us feel safe. I want to thank all of those who are involved in this particular room to making our Senate sittings a success. And of course, there's so much that goes on outside of this chamber. All the support staff, those downstairs who have fed us so well over the last few years. The ladies who take such good care of us, who've come to know all of us individually. They know our preferences. They know they can serve us without even asking, and they have been very attentive to us. All of those who serve downstairs, all those who are responsible for making this hall, this chamber, Madam President, look and keep it in such a condition as it is. The maintenance staff, the cleaning staff, those responsible for the sound as well. All of these people, we want to thank them, Madam President. We don't see all of them, but we want to thank them as well for their very, very important contribution. And as I mentioned, the sound, all those responsible for the media, and certainly the media house that would carry our debates live. I want to thank them as well for ensuring that they continue to be that conduit between what happens here and what happens in the public, so that the public continues to be aware of what is going on. And of course, Madam President, we have to thank the public. When we leave in here, we get the feedback from the public because they hear it in the media, they hear it live, but of course also the other media houses would carry reports. We want to thank them as well. And the public stays in tune, and they always have their contribution to make. They've been so encouraging to us, and we're always reminded as we stand here and speak that they're out there listening. And while, Madam President, we know that we are addressing you, we are also mindful that we are speaking to the nation. And so we thank the public for their support and for all those who make it possible for what we say in here to be carried in the public, Madam President. And I think I have thanked just about everybody who is involved. And just in case there is someone I have missed, I want to say a general thank you to all of those that we have come into contact with or that indirectly have been responsible for this Senate session. As I said, it has been a success, and it has been my privilege also to have had the honor to serve often as the acting leader. That certainly has been a privilege and for me an opportunity of growth as well. So, Madam President, I do want to thank you for that, and with that I beg to move that this sitting be adjourned sine die.
Senator Trotman.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I believe that those persons of the cloth who are here, and persons of the cloth generally, should be seen by us as persons who have been given an awesome responsibility and can be said to be carrying out that responsibility to work in what is the greatest calling that there might be, and that is the calling of being able to follow the instructions of the good Lord himself when he spoke to Peter and told him that he had the responsibility for carrying out the responsibility to bring mankind back to himself. I think that after that, though, that those of us who have the honor to serve in the parliaments of our countries have got not the same level of responsibility, because our master is not as demanding. But we do have an awesome responsibility in that we have to understand what is the will of our instructors, that is our electorates, and those of us in this room who will be facing electors shortly must always understand that those are in fact the principals, the bosses in the exercise, and the more we understand what the instructions are and seek to relate to those instructions, the better can they have the confidence to rely or to repose their confidence in us, and therefore for us to have the results we look for. I say that only in passing because I myself am not a politician and I don't quite understand how these things work. But I do think that those of us who are given the responsibility to speak for and on behalf of the population, however we are elected or nominated, that our task is an awesome task. And I would wish, Madam President, to congratulate every one of my colleagues in this room, and not in this room today, but part of this room, for the contributions they made over the last 5 years. I don't think that we could all of us agree with one another regarding what the quality of those contributions are, but we make bold to believe that all the contributions were said from the integrity of their hearts and the levels of our hearts and the levels of our understandings of the issues which are before us. It's difficult to want to wish everybody the best of luck because then if you say that, you are being dishonest to yourself. But I would like to wish those who are looking forward to another level of representation, wish them all the luck that they deserve by the contributions that they have been making in the preparatory season leading up to this occasion. I think that is the best way to put this, and I look to my colleagues on my left and on my right for guidance regarding whether that has been put in the right way. I know the time is going to be difficult. I hope that everybody will have the strength and the energy. We don't know what the future will hold. I hope that if I'm back here, I wouldn't see some of you. But then I don't know that I'll be back here. And the question as to where we are is not our decision to make. It is now in the hands of somebody who is greater, Madam President, than you or I. So what is left for me to do is to wish good strength, good energy, success for those of you who will carry the battle and those who do not yourself have to nurse constituencies. I hope that you will give support to those who are having to carry the torch and to bear the flag. It is left for me only then to thank you for being good fellow senators and for helping to improve the education, each one of us of the other one. And I'd wish in that regard as well to thank the clerks for their assistance and their guidance, and for the other support staff members, both inside the room and those on the outside, but who feed into the room with their levels of contribution from time to time. I would wish as well to thank the members of the Royal Barbados Police Force. I've noted with interest that some seem to be following a course in how next to move to this level, because they've been here for every moment of the recent past, and I congratulate them to their stick-to-itiveness and to the level of seriousness and grave attention that they're brought to the exercises. Those from the government side, I mean the administration of government, who have been helping with the papers and the preparation of the documents that we have been using, again, we want to compliment them for their assiduous following and supporting of these exercises. To the press, to the caterers, to everyone else who have, to all those others who have been very, very important to us, including our single spectator who comes, she's not here now, but comes on every occasion. We want to give persons like those our undying gratitude and our thanks for their helpfulness. And so that I don't go on too long, beyond this, I look forward, though not seeing some of you here, to seeing and sharing fellowship with you from time to time. And Madam, last but not least, we have to thank you for the charm and grace that you have brought to this chamber. And we thank you so much for being able to bring that level of pleasantness, of love. I don't want to use sexist language, so I wouldn't say tenderness, but I much prefer seeing you than your predecessors in office. And therefore, I wish you all the best and hope that if you return here, those that you will have, if you have returned, those that you will have will be as cooperative and obedient to your office and guidance as some of us have been.
As I prepare to put the question regarding the adjournment, I pause to reflect on my past 5 years of this session, and indeed my last 10 years in this chamber. And I will say this, I've been often asked by my friends, how do you deal with those cantankerous people? Who all remain nameless and unidentified. I tell them it is an honor and a privilege to work with them, and I actually prefer when they're cantankerous because it keeps the place lively and interesting. But more important than that, the contributions that are made here are always to the upliftment of our country. All of us are always mindful of the fact that we are not here for our own aggrandizement, our own upliftment. We are here to serve our country, to serve our people. Whether we are government, independent, or opposition, we all have been called to a particular purpose. And I must say that everyone has acquitted themselves nobly in this purpose. So I thank you. I also thank the senators for keeping me on my toes, for keeping these discussions relevant, for keeping the discussions, even when some may think not relevant, they were always done to empower, uplift, and educate our people. The staff of Parliament. Over the years, the staff of this Parliament have always been a tower of strength to me personally, but to all of us in this chamber. The clerks guide us. They are always on hand to ensure that we follow correct procedures. They smooth out the challenges, and they hold our hands at the beginning, and they cheer us on as we go to ensure that we acquit ourselves nobly. The marshals, the police, they all keep everything running smoothly. But then there are those members of staff who we do not see in this chamber, but they work just as hard. They work to make sure that everything in this Parliament runs to perfection. From the maids, the staff in the journal, the Hansard staff, the account staff, all staff members at Parliament. Even those that most of us never interact with, we are all appreciative of the service that you give to your country. People may think that the admin staff at Parliament are simply those, but they are all committed to ensuring that whatever we do here, whether it is conducting tours of our museum, or producing the order papers, uploading things to the internet, whatever it is their responsibilities are, they all do it nobly, and they all do it with dedication to ensure that our Parliament remains a beacon, a light, and more importantly, an example to all other parliaments in this hemisphere and beyond. And so we thank all of you. As we prepare to end this session, may I wish each and every one of you a peaceful recess. To those of us who may return here, we look forward to being back. To those of us who may not, who may go on to other service, we wish you all the best. And most importantly, let us continue to conduct ourselves with the dignity that we have been known to be characterized with. And so with those words, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you. The question is that this sitting do now adjourn sine die. Those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, the ayes have it. Accordingly, this sitting is now adjourned sine die. Hey, it's the last time I got to do it for a while.